The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was suffocatingly opulent, a sea of black ties and glittering jewels where power was the main currency. Arthur stood at the center of it all, a king surveying his court, with his wife Clara standing beside him like a perfectly crafted, silent accessory. The air hummed with the low murmur of the city's elite, their voices blending with the clinking of champagne flutes as a priceless Jean-Michel Basquiat painting came up for auction. This was Arthur's natural habitat, a stage where he could publicly display his wealth and dominance. His arm was draped possessively around Clara's shoulders, a gesture that looked like affection but felt like ownership. He wore a smile that was all teeth and ambition, utterly confident that this night, like every other, belonged to him. Clara's expression, however, was a placid mask, revealing nothing of the intricate calculations happening behind her serene blue eyes. She was an object of beauty in a room full of them, easily overlooked and profoundly underestimated. The bidding began, a rapid-fire exchange of numbers that escalated into the millions. Arthur, ever the showman, let the tension build before raising his paddle with a theatrical flourish, his bid silencing the room for a moment before a wave of impressed whispers followed. It was then that Clara leaned in, her voice a soft whisper meant only for his ear, offering a sharp, insightful comment about the painting's provenance and its potential vulnerability in a fluctuating art market. It was a brilliant observation, the kind she used to make in the early days when they were building his company from the ground up, but those days were long gone. Arthur's smile tightened, his eyes flashing with irritation. He saw her intelligence not as a contribution, but as an insubordination, a crack in the flawless facade of the docile wife he presented to the world. He pulled away slightly, creating just enough space to turn her quiet comment into a public spectacle. The other guests at their table fell silent, sensing the familiar, uncomfortable chill that preceded one of Arthur's casual cruelties. With a patronizing pat on her hand, Arthur's voice boomed across the table, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. "Darling, leave the investment decisions to me. Your only job here is to look beautiful." The words struck with surgical precision, a public assassination of her worth. A thick, awkward silence descended upon their table, the air crackling with shared embarrassment. Clara felt the hot sting of humiliation creep up her neck, her face flushing under the weight of a dozen pairs of pitying eyes. He had not just dismissed her opinion, he had publicly declared her an ignorant decoration, a beautiful but empty vessel whose only function was to reflect his own greatness. In that single brutal sentence, he had summarized 2 decades of her life with him. Her ideas stolen, her contributions erased, her identity whittled down to nothing more than a pretty face. For a moment she felt the familiar pang of helplessness, the cold realization that to him, and to this world, she was utterly invisible. But as Arthur turned his attention back to the auctioneer, preening under the spotlight of his own manufactured drama, something inside Clara crystallized. The flicker of pain in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in her bones. A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched her lips before vanishing. Her gaze drifted over Arthur's shoulder, scanning the crowd until it found him. Mr. Sterling, her husband's former business partner and mentor, seated alone at a discreet table near the back. Sterling, a man whose genius Arthur had used and then discarded, met her eyes from across the room and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent, powerful confirmation. A pact sealed in a moment of public disgrace. Arthur, blinded by his own ego, had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought he was putting his wife in her place, But he had just given her the final, undeniable reason to pull the trigger on a war he didn't even know was being waged against him. This public shaming was the culmination of years of quiet suffering. Clara had been the unseen architect of Arthur's empire, the strategic mind who had transformed her raw ambition into a billion-dollar enterprise. It was her financial models that secured their first round of funding, her negotiation skills that closed their most critical deals. But as the company flourished and their wealth grew, Arthur methodically wrote her out of the corporate history, recasting himself as the lone visionary. He had forgotten that the person who helps lay the foundation of a fortress also knows where every secret passage and structural weakness is hidden. He had come to believe his own myth, seeing Clara as a beautiful but simple woman, completely dependent on his generosity and incapable of understanding the complex world of finance he now inhabited. Her silence he mistook for submission, her grace for weakness. His fatal flaw wasn't just arrogance, it was the profound inability to see the brilliant, calculating woman standing right beside him. While Arthur paraded his wealth for all to see, he remained blissfully unaware that Clara was building an empire of her own right under his nose. The lavish allowance he provided, which he smugly assumed she squandered on couture and charity luncheons, was in reality her seed capital. Guided by the shrewd advice of Mr. Sterling, a man hungry for his own form of justice, Clara had spent the last decade meticulously investing. She turned a modest inheritance from her grandmother into a secret, formidable investment fund, operating through a labyrinth of shell corporations. She played the role of the perfect trophy wife flawlessly, her days a carefully constructed performance of leisurely shopping trips and social engagements, all while she was remotely managing a portfolio that was growing exponentially. She knew his company's vulnerabilities better than his own board of directors because she had been studying them for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tonight's humiliation was not the start of her rebellion, it was the final authorization to launch the attack. As the auctioneer's gavel came down, sealing Arthur's victory on the Basquiat, he felt a surge of triumphant power. He was the master of his universe, a man who could acquire beauty and influence with the flick of a wrist. He accepted the fawning congratulations from his peers, his ego expanding with every sycophantic compliment. He glanced at Clara, expecting to see the sullen resentment of a chastised child. Instead, he found an unnerving serenity, a placid calm that he couldn't quite decipher. He dismissed it as her being in shock. He had no idea that beneath the damask tablecloth, her thumb was scrolling through a secure messaging app on her phone, confirming a series of massive block trades. Under the guise of an obscure foreign entity named Orion Capital Group, she was executing the final phase of a hostile takeover. While he was spending millions on a piece of art to adorn his wall, she was spending hundreds of millions to acquire the very company that gave him his name. The opulent ballroom was a theater of blissful ignorance. The elite of New York society toasted to Arthur's success, oblivious to the tectonic shift in power happening silently in their midst. Clara lifted her own glass of champagne, her eyes meeting Mr. Sterling's once more across the crowded room. It was a silent toast to a meticulously planned, elegantly executed revenge. The game was over. Arthur was now merely a figurehead in a company he no longer controlled. He just hadn't received the memo yet. He believed this night was the apex of his power, a testament to his infallible genius. In truth, it was the grand, glittering funeral for his reign, and the chief mourner was the woman he had just tried to silence. He had spent a lifetime putting her in his shadow, never realizing that from the shadows she could see everything. And now she was stepping into the light to claim it all as her own.
Their story hadn't begun in the cold, sterile world of corporate boardrooms and charity galas, but in a cramped third-floor walk-up apartment that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and ambition. 20 years ago, Arthur was a man with a powerful vision but no roadmap. His charisma a raw, untamed force. Clara was the quiet genius, a recent business school graduate with a mind that saw patterns in numbers the way a composer hears a symphony. She was the one who spent sleepless nights building the financial models that made his wild ideas seem not just plausible, but inevitable. It was her strategy that turned a fledgling startup funded by a second mortgage on her parents' home into a viable enterprise. In those early days, they were a perfect partnership. He was the voice and the face, but she was the engine and the architect. They were a team, equals in every sense, building an empire on a foundation of shared dreams and mutual respect. A foundation Arthur would later meticulously demolish, brick by brick, until only his monument to himself remained. The shift was subtle at first, a slow, creeping poison. As the company grew, Arthur began to argue that Clara's presence in executive meetings was distracting to potential investors who preferred a more traditional image. "Let me be the bulldog, darling," he'd say, his voice laced with a honeyed condescension that she didn't recognize as a threat at the time. "You work your magic behind the scenes. We need a clean, powerful narrative." He convinced her that her retreat from the public eye was a strategic sacrifice for their shared success. So she stepped back, becoming a ghost in the machine she had built, her name gradually fading from company lore. She managed the finances from a home office, vetted acquisitions, and drafted the very speeches that would earn Arthur accolades as a lone visionary. She had willingly become his shadow, believing it was for the good of their empire, never imagining that he would one day come to despise the very darkness that allowed his own light to shine so brightly. The first casualty of Arthur's burgeoning ego was Mr. Sterling, the seasoned mentor who had co-founded the initial venture with them. Sterling was a man of quiet integrity and old-school principles, and he saw the dangerous turn Arthur's ambition was taking. He cautioned against the reckless expansion and the creative accounting Arthur was beginning to favor. Instead of heeding the advice, Arthur saw it as a challenge to his authority. In a brutal boardroom maneuver, he orchestrated Sterling's ousting, painting him as an outdated relic holding the company back. Clara watched in horrified silence as Arthur systematically erased his own mentor, a man who had been like a father to him. That was the day she realized Arthur's loyalty was not to people, but to power. He wasn't just building a company anymore, he was constructing a kingdom, and in his kingdom there was only one king. Anyone who had helped him ascend was now simply a witness to his greatness, and witnesses could become liabilities. The first time he stole her work outright was at a press conference announcing a landmark acquisition that had been entirely her brainchild. She had spent 6 months negotiating the deal through back channels, using her analytical skills to identify the target company's hidden value when everyone else saw only risk. She stood in the back of the crowded room, watching as Arthur stood at the podium, basking in the flash of cameras, and described her exact strategy as if it had come to him in a moment of solitary genius. He didn't even glance in her direction. The applause was deafening, but all Clara could hear was the shattering of their partnership. The pain was sharp and physical, a cold knife twisting in her gut. That night he came home with a ridiculously expensive diamond bracelet, a guilt offering she recognized immediately. "A little something for my beautiful wife," he'd said, kissing her forehead. He wasn't thanking her for her work, he was paying her for her silence, reducing her from a partner to a handsomely compensated employee whose contributions would forever remain off the books. It was then that he began curating her new identity.
He encouraged her to chair charity committees, oversee the renovation of their sprawling mansion, and cultivate a social circle of other powerful wives. He framed it as a gift, a life of leisure she had earned. "You've worked so hard," he would tell their friends at dinner parties, placing a proprietary hand on her shoulder. "Now it's time for you to relax and enjoy the fruits of our labor." But it wasn't a gift, it was a cage, albeit a gilded one. He was isolating her from the world she understood, the world of finance and strategy, and pushing her into a sphere where her intelligence was irrelevant. Her new job was to be a testament to his success, a beautiful, serene hostess who could speak knowledgeably about art and philanthropy, but not about profit margins or hostile takeovers. He was demoting her from co-founder to brand ambassador, and the brand was him. Her compliance was not weakness, it was a calculated retreat to observe the enemy from a new, unexpected vantage point. Her grandmother's death provided the spark. The inheritance was modest by their new standards, a sum Arthur dismissed as pocket money. But to Clara it was the seed of her liberation. She remembered her grandmother's words. "A woman must always have a garden of her own, a place where she can grow things for herself." With that in mind, she didn't spend the money on jewelry or designer bags. Instead, she quietly opened a brokerage account under her maiden name. Her first investments were small and cautious, but her innate understanding of the market, honed by years of managing Arthur's corporate finances, yielded incredible results. Soon after, she reached out to a heartbroken but still brilliant Mr. Sterling. They met in a discreet coffee shop far from the prying eyes of their world. There, amidst the aroma of roasting beans, they forged a new alliance. He would provide the wisdom and the network she could no longer access, and she would provide the capital and the insider knowledge. Their shared goal was not just profit, it was justice. The arrival of Vanessa, a social media influencer half Arthur's age, marked the final stage of his descent into open contempt. Vanessa was everything Clara was not: loud, superficial, and utterly transactional. She flaunted Arthur's gifts on her social media, her posts a vulgar catalog of his wealth. Arthur didn't even bother to be discreet. He began bringing Vanessa to industry events, introducing her as his protégé, a flimsy excuse that fooled no one. Her presence was a daily public humiliation for Clara, a constant reminder that in Arthur's eyes she was now old, boring, and easily replaceable. He had once admired her mind, but now he only valued the fleeting currency of youth and novelty. Vanessa's ambition was as transparent as her designer dresses. She wanted to be the next Mrs. King, and Arthur was letting her audition for the role in front of his wife. The cruelty was the point. He wanted Clara to feel worthless, to feel like a relic he was about to put into storage. His private mockery soon became a public sport. At a dinner with his board of directors, Clara made a thoughtful comment about a potential market downturn in Asia. Arthur laughed, a loud, dismissive sound that made the entire table flinch. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about that, sweetheart," he said, patting her hand as if she were a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. The other executives stared at their plates, their discomfort a thick, palpable fog in the room. Clara felt her face burn, but she held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't argue, she didn't cry.
She simply absorbed the insult, filing it away with 1,000 others that came before it. Each public humiliation was another piece of evidence, another log on the fire of her resolve. He thought he was breaking her spirit, but he was merely forging it into something harder and sharper than he could ever imagine. He was teaching her, with every cruel word, exactly how to be as ruthless as he was. The tipping point came a month before the auction. Arthur called her into his cavernous, mahogany-paneled study, a room she had once helped design but now rarely entered.
He slid a thick stack of documents across the polished desk. "Just some legal housekeeping," he said casually, not making eye contact. "Restructuring our personal assets, for tax purposes. Just sign at the bottom." She recognized the papers for what they were, a systematic effort to transfer their jointly built fortune into a series of trusts that she would have no claim to. He was preparing to divorce her, and he was ensuring she would walk away with nothing but a token settlement. He was so confident in her ignorance, so convinced she was the decorative fool he had created, that he didn't even bother to explain the documents properly. He just assumed she would sign. She smiled sweetly, told him she'd have her lawyer look them over as a formality, and watched the flash of annoyance in his eyes. He hated that she even had a lawyer. He had no idea her lawyer was a shark, and they were no longer playing defense. On the evening of the Metropolitan Museum Gala, as she fastened the clasp of a diamond necklace, one of his many payments for her silence, Clara felt a profound sense of calm. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, but she didn't see the humiliated wife Arthur saw. She saw a soldier preparing for the final battle. She had spent a decade playing a role, enduring his scorn, and quietly building her arsenal. The documents he wanted her to sign were still sitting on her desk, unsigned. The funds in her secret account had reached their target number. Mr. Sterling had confirmed that Arthur's company was dangerously over-leveraged, vulnerable to a hostile takeover from an entity with enough liquid capital. Tonight, Arthur planned to put her in her place one last time, a public spectacle to cement his dominance before he discarded her. What he didn't know was that she was attending the gala not as his wife, but as the anonymous CEO of Orion Capital Group. He was about to perform on the grandest stage of his life, completely unaware that she owned the theater, the stage, and the lights. The chill from the auction night lingered long after the champagne had gone flat, settling into the very bones of their sprawling mansion. Arthur treated his public jab not as a transgression to be apologized for, but as a new policy to be enforced. His conversations with Clara became clipped and dismissive. Her opinions on any matter of substance, from market trends discussed on the evening news to the selection of wine for dinner, were met with a condescending wave of his hand. "Let's not overcomplicate things, shall we?" His eyes already drifting toward his phone, where a stream of notifications from Vanessa provided a more amusing distraction. He moved through their shared spaces with the air of a man who was merely tolerating a long-term tenant whose lease was about to expire. He spoke of refreshing the house, of bringing in a new energy. And Clara understood perfectly. He wasn't just redecorating a home. He was methodically erasing her presence from the life she had painstakingly built, preparing the canvas for his next masterpiece of betrayal. The first tangible assault came a week later. Clara descended the grand staircase to find Vanessa in the formal living room, running a perfectly manicured finger over the silk upholstery of a chair Clara had chosen years ago. Arthur stood beside her, beaming like a proud curator. "Vanessa has such a wonderful eye for modern design," he announced, his tone leaving no room for debate. Vanessa offered Clara a saccharine smile, a predatory glint in her eyes. "It's lovely, of course," she purred, the compliment dripping with poison. "Just a little heavy. It needs light, air." For the next hour, Clara was forced to stand by in silent agony as Vanessa walked through her home, pointing out every perceived flaw, every piece of furniture to be discarded, every wall to be repainted. Arthur nodded in agreement to every suggestion, treating his mistress's vapid whims as gospel,
while his wife, the true architect of their life, was rendered an invisible, irrelevant ghost in her own home. The campaign of erasure extended to the family, his family, who had once embraced Clara as a daughter. At their next Sunday dinner, a ritual Clara used to cherish, she found herself demoted from hostess to glorified help. Arthur's mother, a woman who had once praised Clara's grace, now directed all her questions and compliments to Vanessa, who sat in Clara's traditional seat at the table. When Arthur's brother asked for another bottle of the vintage, Arthur gestured dismissively toward Clara. "Clara, be a dear and fetch it from the cellar, would you?" he commanded, not even bothering to look at her. The table fell into a brief, uncomfortable silence before his family quickly resumed their fawning conversation with Vanessa.
As Clara walked to the cellar, the echoes of their laughter followed her, each burst a fresh stab of humiliation. She was no longer a member of the family. She was staff, a silent functionary whose only purpose was to serve the new queen and her court. The isolation was absolute, a cold, clear message that her time was over. Vanessa, emboldened by Arthur's public endorsement and the family's sycophantic acceptance, grew more audacious. During a small garden party at the estate, she cornered Clara near the rose bushes, her voice a venomous whisper under the polite chatter of the guests. She held up her left hand, showcasing a new, ostentatious canary diamond ring that screamed of new money. "Arthur is so generous," she sighed theatrically, before her eyes landed on the simple, elegant platinum band on Clara's finger. "That's your wedding ring, isn't it?" she asked, her lip curling in a faint sneer. "It's very classic, almost antique." The insult was designed to inflict maximum pain, reducing 2 decades of marriage, of partnership and sacrifice to an outdated relic. Vanessa was not just a rival for Arthur's affection, she was a vulture picking at the bones of Clara's life, mocking the very symbols of her commitment and love, while flaunting the spoils of her impending victory. Clara simply stared back, her face a mask of placid control, but inside, a glacier of cold fury was slowly, inexorably beginning to move. The public humiliation soon bled into the few remaining corners of Clara's independent life. She had long served as the chair of the board for the city's most prestigious children's hospital charity, a role she took immense pride in. It was her one space, a place where her name meant something beyond Arthur's wife. That ended with a sterile, impersonal email. The board, it said, had voted to move in a new direction and thanked her for her years of service. She knew Arthur's hand was behind it. A few days later, a glossy magazine featured a glowing profile on the charity's dynamic new board member, Vanessa, praised for her fresh, youthful energy and social media savvy. Arthur had not just taken her home and her family, he had systematically stripped her of her public identity, her last shred of purpose outside the gilded cage of their marriage. He was ensuring that when he finally discarded her, she would have nothing left, no community to fall back on, no reputation to her name. She would be a nobody, exactly as he intended. Even her role as a loving aunt was weaponized against her. At the lavish 5th birthday party for Arthur's nephew, held at an exclusive country club, Clara found herself relegated to the background, an unpaid and unacknowledged nanny. While Arthur and Vanessa stood with his brother and sister-in-law, accepting compliments on what a beautiful couple they made, Clara was the one chasing the birthday boy, wiping cake from his face and making sure he didn't wander too close to the pool. The other parents smiled at her politely, assuming she was the hired help. Not once did Arthur or his family correct them. They allowed her to be invisible, to perform the labor of love and care without any of the recognition. At one point, she overheard Arthur's sister-in-law whispering to another mother, "Vanessa is so wonderful with him. She'll make a fantastic mother." The words were a twisting knife, erasing Clara's years of genuine affection and recasting her as a placeholder until the real family could begin. The next blow was aimed directly at her perceived independence. Arthur summoned her to his home office, the same room where he'd once asked her to sign away her rights. He didn't offer her a seat. He leaned back in his leather throne, a picture of magnanimous authority, and informed her that he was restructuring their household finances. This, he explained with a patronizing smile, meant her personal allowance would be significantly reduced. "We all have to make sacrifices in this economy," he said, the lie so blatant it was almost comical. Just the day before, she had seen the paperwork for the new custom Bentley he had ordered for Vanessa. This wasn't about saving money, it was about control. He believed her entire existence was funded by his generosity, and by tightening the purse strings, he thought he was tightening his leash, reminding her that she was nothing without him. He had no idea that her real wealth, her true power, operated in a completely different universe, one where his pocket change was utterly irrelevant. The final, most brutal violation occurred when she returned from a weekend visiting her ailing mother. She walked up to her private study, the one room in the mansion that was unequivocally hers, a sanctuary filled with her books, her old financial journals, and photos of her grandmother. But the antique oak door was gone, replaced by a sleek pane of frosted glass. Pushing it open, she froze in the doorway. The room was unrecognizable. Her mahogany desk had been replaced by a white minimalist table. The bookshelves were gone, the walls now painted a garish shade of millennial pink. In the corner stood a ring light and professional camera equipment. Her entire life's intellectual and emotional history, her books, her journals, her memories, had been unceremoniously packed into cardboard boxes and shoved into a corner.
Arthur had given her sanctuary to Vanessa to use as a content creation studio. He hadn't just invaded her home, he had desecrated her soul, proving that not a single part of her life was safe from his contempt. Sitting on the floor amidst the cardboard boxes that held the remnants of her identity, something inside Clara finally broke. The carefully constructed dam of composure she had maintained for years crumbled, and a wave of pure, unadulterated desolation washed over her. It wasn't loud, theatrical sobbing, but a silent, gut-wrenching grief. Every insult, every public slight, every casual cruelty coalesced into a single crushing weight. She felt like discarded trash, an object that had served its purpose and was now being tossed aside for a newer model. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket that made her want to shrink into nothingness. For a long, dark moment, she truly hit the bottom. There was nothing left of the woman she had been, the partner, the strategist, the wife. Arthur had won. He had successfully erased her. She closed her eyes, wishing she could simply dissolve, vanish from a world that no longer had a place for her. But in that abyss of absolute despair, as the last tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, a different feeling began to surface. It started as a tiny cold ember in the pit of her stomach. The pain was still there, but it was no longer just a source of suffering. It was becoming fuel. The desire to disappear was slowly, miraculously, being replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She opened her eyes, and the reflection she saw in the darkened screen of Vanessa's new monitor was not that of a victim. The shame was gone, burned away by a sudden, chilling clarity. Arthur had made a fatal error. He thought that by destroying her world, he was destroying her. He didn't realize he was simply clearing the battlefield.
He had taken everything from her, leaving her with nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. A slow, dangerous smile touched her lips. The performance was over. She would still play the part of the broken wife for a little while longer. But the woman who rose from the floor of that desecrated room was no longer Clara the wife. She was Orion, the hunter. And the hunt was about to begin. The chill from the desecrated study floor seeped into her bones, but it was no longer the cold of despair. It was the icy calm of purpose. Clara rose slowly, her movements deliberate, brushing the dust from her designer slacks as if shedding the last remnants of the victim she had been forced to play. The cardboard boxes holding her past no longer looked like a pile of discarded memories. They were an arsenal of motivation. She walked out of the pink-walled monstrosity without a backward glance, her steps echoing in the silent, cavernous mansion. In the privacy of a guest room, she retrieved a small encrypted satellite phone from a hidden compartment in her travel case. She dialed a number known only to her and one other person. When the familiar, gravelly voice of Mr. Sterling answered, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "It's time," she said, her own voice steady and devoid of emotion. "He's moved to liquidate my position. The final pieces are in place." A long pause followed before Sterling simply replied, "The usual place. 1 hour." The call ended. There was no need for more words. The war had been declared, and her general had just been summoned. They met in the hushed leather and mahogany confines of a private library in an old gentleman's club, a place so steeped in tradition and discretion that time itself seemed to move slower. Mr. Sterling, with his shock of white hair and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 boardroom battles, looked at Clara over the rim of his glasses. He saw not the broken woman he had half expected, but a queen preparing her chessboard. She laid out Arthur's recent aggressions with the detached precision of a field commander reporting enemy movements. The public humiliations, the social exile, the invasion of her home, and finally, the legal documents designed to strip her of everything. "He believes I am a fool," she stated, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "He is so blinded by his own narrative of the brilliant man and the beautiful simple wife that he handed me his entire strategy on a silver platter. He thinks he's preparing for a divorce settlement. He has no idea he's provided the justification for a corporate execution." Sterling listened, a slow, grim smile forming on his face. He had waited years for this. He had always known the brilliant mind Arthur had tried so hard to bury. "His arrogance will be his undoing, my dear," Sterling began, his voice a conspiratorial whisper as he pushed a thin file across the polished table. "It already is. I've been monitoring the company's financials through some old, loyal channels. He's a gambler, not a strategist. To fund his last 2 vanity acquisitions and, I suspect, Vanessa's rather expensive lifestyle, he has leveraged the company to the hilt. He's borrowed against every solid asset they have, converting the firm's stability into a mountain of high-interest corporate debt. The balance sheets are a work of fiction, propped up by projected earnings that will never materialize." He tapped a specific page in the file. "The company looks like a titan from the outside, but it's a hollow shell."
One bad quarter, one significant dip in stock price, and the creditors could trigger covenants that would shatter the whole facade. He's built a glass castle and is convinced it's made of granite. The weakness isn't just a crack in the foundation, Clara. The entire structure is compromised. This was the confirmation she needed, the precise, actionable intelligence that would transform her wealth into a weapon.
Clara absorbed the information, her mind already racing, connecting the dots with the speed of a supercomputer. She saw the path forward with absolute clarity. It was Sterling who gave the strategy a name. "A hostile takeover," he said, leaning forward, the excitement clear in his voice. "It's the most elegant form of corporate warfare. We don't attack the castle walls, we simply buy the land it's built on. The debt he's accumulated is held by a handful of investment banks. They see it as a volatile asset. If a private entity, an anonymous one, were to approach them and offer to buy that debt, even at a slight premium, they would likely sell to offload the risk. The entity that holds the debt holds the power. Once you control his financial lifeline, you can dictate terms. You can force a restructuring. Or," he paused for dramatic effect, "you can use that leverage, combined with a strategic stock purchase, to acquire a controlling interest. You could take it all, Clara, everything." He presented it as a monumental, almost impossible task, a test of her resolve. A serene smile graced Clara's lips for the first time that day. She slid the file back toward him and opened her clutch, retrieving a slim, state-of-the-art tablet. With a few taps, she brought up a secure portal, the screen glowing with the logo of a stylized constellation, Orion Capital Group. The main page displayed a single staggering number representing the fund's current liquid assets. Mr. Sterling's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. He had helped her make the initial investments, guided her through the early years, but he had not been privy to the full scoop of her operations for the last 5. He knew she was successful. He had no idea she had become a financial powerhouse in her own right, an invisible whale moving silently through the deepest waters of the market. "The question isn't whether we can afford to buy the debt, William," Clara said softly, her voice resonating with a power he had never heard before. "The question is whether we want to leave him with enough to afford a lawyer when we're done. Orion Capital is ready to hunt." In that moment, their partnership was transformed. He was no longer just the mentor. He was the trusted advisor to a new and formidable titan of industry. The plan was forged in the quiet library over the next 2 hours, a masterpiece of financial subterfuge. Sterling, energized by the prospect of long-overdue justice, sketched out the sequence of events on a napkin. Phase 1. Orion Capital would discreetly contact the banks holding Arthur's corporate debt, using a third-party broker in Zurich to ensure complete anonymity. They would acquire a controlling position in the debt, becoming Arthur's primary and silent creditor. Phase 2. They would wait. Arthur's next quarterly earnings report was in 3 weeks, and Sterling's inside sources confirmed it would be a disaster. The moment the bad news hit the market and the stock price inevitably tumbled, Orion would strike. Phase 3. A massive block purchase of common stock, executed in a series of rapid trades to avoid detection until it was too late. The goal was simple and audacious: acquire 51%. Secure an undeniable majority. It was a plan that required patience, precision, and nerves of steel. Looking at Clara's calm, determined face, Sterling knew she possessed all 3 in abundance. He was witnessing the birth of a predator. When Clara returned to the mansion, it was as if she had passed through a portal into another reality. The air, once thick with oppression and her own silent grief, now felt thin and insignificant. She found Arthur and Vanessa lounging by the pool, their laughter echoing across the manicured lawns as they discussed which new sports car he should buy her. He saw Clara approach, and his smile tightened into a familiar smirk. "There you are," he called out, his tone dripping with condescending concern. I was worried you'd locked yourself away to cry all day. Feeling more like yourself?" Vanessa giggled, hiding her face behind a copy of a fashion magazine. Clara simply nodded, her expression placid and unreadable. "Much better, thank you," she replied, her voice soft and gentle. "I just needed some air." She played the part of the meek, recovering wife so perfectly that Arthur lost interest immediately, turning his attention back to the more important matter of Vanessa's happiness. He saw her obedience as a victory, a sign that she had finally accepted her place. He had no idea he was looking at the woman who was actively plotting the complete and total demolition of his world. Later that night, the house was silent except for the distant hum of the city. In the sterile anonymity of the guest room, Clara sat in the dark, her face illuminated only by the cool blue light of her tablet. Her fingers moved across the screen, navigating encrypted channels and offshore accounts with practiced ease.
She reviewed the final details of the wire transfer authorization, a sum of money so vast it could have purchased a small country. It was the first move, the opening salvo in a war Arthur didn't even know was being fought. With a final decisive tap, she executed the transaction. Billions of dollars began their silent journey across the globe, destined for the coffers of a Swiss bank, where they would be used to purchase the chains that would soon bind her husband. A confirmation message blinked on the screen. Acquisition initiated. She closed the tablet and looked out the window at the glittering skyline, at the distant tower where Arthur's name was emblazoned in lights. It was a monument to his ego, and she was about to tear it down, brick by brick. The hunt had officially begun. While Clara was silently assembling her war machine, Arthur was busy dismantling his own life with the cheerful confidence of a man who believed he was in complete control. He spent his days in a series of triumphant meetings with his divorce attorneys, a team of aggressive sharks who assured him that Clara, with her lack of independent income and her lifestyle funded entirely by his generosity, would be lucky to walk away with one of their smaller mansions and a token alimony. He laughed as he signed the papers to freeze their joint accounts, imagining her shock and helplessness. He paraded Vanessa around the city, a glittering symbol of his virility and renewed power, promising her a wedding that would make royalty jealous and a future as the queen of his empire. He was so engrossed in the performance of his own invincibility, so certain of the script he had written for everyone's lives, that he never once thought to check if his leading lady had decided to write a new ending for herself. His world was a stage, and in his mind he was the only one with a speaking part, completely deaf to the sounds of the set being dismantled all around him. In stark contrast to Arthur's loud and public preparations for her dismissal, Clara's movements were a study in silent, lethal efficiency. She met not with divorce lawyers, but with a discreet and formidable team of corporate litigators from a firm so powerful they didn't even have a sign on their building. In a soundproofed conference room overlooking the city, she wasn't a distraught wife fighting for scraps. She was a CEO outlining a hostile takeover. She spread financial statements across the vast oak table, her analysis of Arthur's corporate debt structure so sharp and insightful that the senior partner, a man who had seen it all, found himself taking notes. She didn't speak of betrayal or emotional pain. She spoke of leverage, fiduciary duty, and shareholder value. She was calm, precise, and utterly ruthless. Her legal team watched her, a sense of awe dawning in their eyes. They had been hired to represent a wealthy woman in a complex financial matter, but they quickly realized they were not advising a client. They were taking orders from a commander who already knew every detail of the battlefield and had a flawless strategy for victory. The first financial salvo was fired from a sterile, glass-walled office in Zurich.
Acting on encrypted instructions from Orion Capital Group, a third-party broker initiated a series of quiet negotiations with the investment banks that held Arthur's company by a financial thread. The banks, already nervous about the company's over-leveraged position, were more than happy to sell the massive debt portfolio to an anonymous buyer offering a slight premium to offload the risk. The transactions were completed in less than 48 hours, a silent, multi-billion-dollar tidal wave that shifted the very foundation of Arthur's power. A single-page notification of the debt transfer landed on the desk of Arthur's CFO, who passed it along to his boss. Arthur glanced at it for less than 10 seconds. Orion Capital? Never heard of him. Probably some foreign fund diversifying. He grunted, tossing the paper into a discard pile. He saw a routine administrative update. He failed to see the executioner's warrant. His arrogance had become a shield, but it was one that blocked his vision, leaving him blind to the dagger aimed directly at his heart. Arthur's blindness was compounded by the constant, glittering distraction that was Vanessa. Her demands grew in direct proportion to his ego, a feedback loop of vanity and greed. She was no longer content with being his mistress. She wanted to be her brand. She insisted he acquire a struggling but high-profile fashion label, not as a sound business investment, but so she could be its public face, its creative director. Consumed by the vision of them as the ultimate power couple, Arthur pursued the acquisition with reckless abandon, funneling millions of dollars of the company's already strained capital into the vanity project. He was so focused on orchestrating his and Vanessa's grand public debut as the new titans of industry and style that he ignored the increasingly frantic calls from his accounting department. Vanessa's insatiable appetite for status was the perfect smokescreen, a dazzling display of fireworks that kept his gaze fixed on the sky, while Clara's army was silently tunneling under the very ground he stood upon, planting the explosives that would bring his entire kingdom crashing down. Miles away from the opulent displays of Arthur's folly, Clara and Mr.
Sterling operated from a Spartan high-tech command center. Their war room was an anonymous office suite leased under a shell corporation, its walls covered not with art but with monitors displaying real-time market data, debt-to-equity ratios, and encrypted communication channels. Sterling, his old fire reignited, pointed to a cascading series of red numbers on one screen. "He's done it," he said, a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction in his voice. "He's diverting capital to the fashion house acquisition. He's weakening his core assets to buy his girlfriend a toy. He's practically inviting us to strike." Clara watched the data streams, her expression unreadable. There was no joy, only a cold, methodical focus. "The quarterly report is in 2 weeks. The numbers will be catastrophic. His vanity has given us the perfect weapon. Accelerate the timeline," she commanded, her voice steady. "When that report goes public and the stock tanks, I want Orion in position to acquire every available share before the market even has time to process the news." They weren't just waiting for him to fall, they were using his own actions to dig the grave deeper. A single, ignored voice of reason tried to break through Arthur's impenetrable wall of self-congratulation. His CFO, a mild-mannered man named Peterson who had been with the company for 30 years, requested an urgent meeting. With trembling hands, he presented a detailed report showing a pattern of unusual, high-volume trading in their stock, originating from anonymous offshore brokers. He also highlighted the grave risk of having their entire corporate debt now consolidated under a single, unknown entity. "Arthur, someone is making a move on us," Peterson pleaded, his voice heavy with concern. "This isn't normal market fluctuation. It feels coordinated, predatory." Arthur leaned back in his chair, a look of utter contempt on his face.
Predatory. Don't be so dramatic, Peterson. It's called an opportunity. While you're cowering under your desk, I'm building an empire. If you can't handle the pressure, perhaps it's time for you to retire. He dismissed his most loyal employee with a wave of his hand, interpreting a desperate warning as a personal insult. He had just been handed a map of the impending attack and, in his hubris, had chosen to set it on fire. With the financial mechanisms humming along, Clara took a moment for a deeply personal and symbolic step in her reclamation. She visited a discreetly located bank in the city's old financial district, using a key that Arthur didn't know existed to access a safe deposit box established under her maiden name decades ago. Inside, nestled in velvet, were the original leather-bound incorporation documents for the company. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, over her own youthful, optimistic signature next to those of Arthur and Mr. Sterling. This wasn't just paper. It was proof. It was the physical manifestation of a history Arthur had tried to erase, a history she was now poised to reclaim with overwhelming force. After returning the documents to their secure home, she sat in the sterile quiet of the viewing room and, using a secure tablet, signed the final authorization for the stock purchase. It was the largest financial transaction of her life, a final commitment to the path of total war. There was no hesitation. Her finger pressed the screen with the cold, steady certainty of a sniper pulling a trigger. The point of no return had been crossed. The trap sprung with the brutal, impersonal efficiency of a market correction. The company's quarterly earnings report was released, and the numbers were even worse than Sterling had predicted. The disastrous results hit the newswires, and within minutes, the company's stock price began to hemorrhage value. As panicked investors started to sell, a massive silent buyer entered the fray. Orion Capital Group, executing a perfectly timed series of block trades through a dozen different brokers, absorbed every share being dumped on the market. It was a digital blitzkrieg, over in less than an hour. By the end of the trading day, the dust settled to reveal a shocking new reality. An unknown entity now held a 51% controlling interest. An emergency notification lit up Arthur's phone. He stared at the words "hostile takeover" in disbelief, which quickly morphed into a thrill. A fight! He immediately called an emergency board meeting for the following morning, his mind already spinning with strategies to fend off this mysterious corporate raider. He felt alive, energized by the challenge, utterly unaware that the vulture fund he was preparing to battle was currently in his own home, selecting a suit for his public execution. The night before the board meeting was a study in contrasts. In his penthouse, Arthur paced his office, a glass of expensive scotch in hand, dictating a fiery speech into his phone. He spoke of loyalty, of fighting for the company's soul against faceless predators, of his unwavering leadership. He felt like a general on the eve of a great battle, confident and righteous. He sent a text to Vanessa. "Big day tomorrow. Get ready to celebrate. We're about to become legends." Across town, Clara's preparations were quieter, more deliberate. She laid out a bespoke power suit, its lines sharp and unforgiving, a modern suit of armor. She reviewed the final legal documents one last time, her focus absolute.
She didn't need a speech. The numbers spoke for her. As dawn broke over the city, her encrypted phone buzzed. It was Mr. Sterling. "It's all in place. The board is assembled. They think you're a representative. Are you ready, Clara?" She stood before a full-length mirror, looking at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. Not a wife, not a victim, but a force of nature. A serene, dangerous calm settled over her.
"I'm ready," she replied, her voice the sound of destiny arriving. "Let's begin." The boardroom on the 80th floor was Arthur's cathedral, a monument to his own perceived divinity. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the polished mahogany table where his board of directors sat, a collection of nervous but loyal disciples. Arthur stood at the head, a king addressing his war council, his voice booming with theatrical confidence. He paced before the panoramic view of the city, a city he believed he owned, and painted a vivid picture of their battle. "Gentlemen," he declared, his fist striking the table for emphasis, "we are under attack. A faceless, parasitic vulture fund by the name of Orion Capital thinks it can swoop in and feast on the empire we have built. They see a dip in our stock, and they smell blood. But what they don't understand is that this company has a heart, a soul, and a leader who will not bend." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, his eyes scanning the faces of his board members. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw their reliance on him. He was their savior, their protector. He thrived on this. This was not a crisis. It was an opportunity to once again prove his own legend. Just as he was about to launch into the second act of his heroic monologue, the frosted glass door to the boardroom slid open with a soft electronic hum. His executive assistant, a young woman named Chloe, stood hesitantly in the doorway, her face pale. "Mr. King, I'm so sorry to interrupt," she stammered, "but there's someone here to see you, a representative from Orion Capital Group." A slow, predatory smile spread across Arthur's face. The enemy had come to him. Perfect. "Excellent," he boomed, a theatrical flourish in his voice. "Don't keep our mysterious guest waiting. Send them in. Let's see the face of this vulture." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, the tension in the room ratcheting up. The door swung fully open, and all eyes turned to greet their antagonist. But the figure that stepped into the room was not some ruthless corporate raider in a pinstripe suit. It was Clara. She paused in the doorway, her calm gaze sweeping across the room, her presence a silent, stunning rebuke to the narrative Arthur had just been weaving. She wore a tailored suit the color of storm clouds, her posture radiating a power no one in that room had ever seen in her before. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. The board members stared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and shock. Arthur's confident smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of pure disbelief. Then, as if his brain had finally caught up, the disbelief curdled into amusement, and then into a wave of hot, righteous anger. He let out a short, barking laugh that echoed unnaturally in the silent room. "Clara? What in the world are you doing here? Did you get lost on your way to a charity auction?" He turned to his board, spreading his hands in a gesture of paternalistic exasperation. "Gentlemen, my sincerest apologies. It seems my wife is a bit confused. The stress of our impending arrangements has clearly taken its toll." He walked toward her, his movements a clear assertion of his dominance, intending to take her by the arm and firmly escort her out. "Darling," he said, his voice laced with condescending pity, "this is a private meeting. The adults are talking business. Why don't you let Chloe get you a car?" He reached for her, fully expecting her to crumble as she always did. But Clara did not crumble. With a fluid, almost imperceptible movement, she sidestepped his grasp, leaving his hand hanging awkwardly in the air. She continued her silent, deliberate walk to the far end of the long table, taking the seat directly opposite him, the seat of a rival. From a slim leather portfolio, she produced a stack of documents and placed them on the table with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to reverberate through the room. "I am not here as your wife, Arthur," she replied, her voice perfectly level, carrying an icy authority that made every person in the room sit up straighter. Arthur's lead attorney, a slick corporate shark named Jennings, leaned forward, his professional curiosity piqued. He picked up the top document, his eyes scanning the first page. His smug expression dissolved, replaced by a ghastly pallor. His hand began to tremble slightly as he recognized the official letterhead of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the intricate details of the debt transfer agreements, and the final damning signatures. He looked up from the papers, his gaze meeting Clara's, and in his eyes was the dawning, sickening realization that they had profoundly, catastrophically misjudged their opponent. "Jennings, what is this garbage?" Arthur demanded, his voice tight with fury. "Get her out of here, now!" But Jennings seemed frozen, his eyes glued to the documents as if they were a serpent about to strike.
He finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Arthur, these are the official filings. They confirm the sale of 100% of the company's consolidated corporate debt. It's all been acquired from the banks and is now held by a single entity." One of the more astute board members, Eleanor Vance, leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Clara. "Acquired by whom?" she asked, her tone cutting through the tension. Clara answered before Jennings could muster a response, her voice resonating with newfound power. "Acquired by Orion Capital Group," she stated simply. "As of 3 days ago, we became your sole creditor. Every loan, every line of credit, every financial instrument that keeps this company afloat now runs through us. We own your debt, gentlemen, which means, in a very real sense, we own you." The ripple of shock that went through the board was palpable. They were no longer looking at their CEO's wife, but at the face of their new master. Arthur's face was a mottled canvas of rage and confusion. He still couldn't process it. He was a lion, and lions were not hunted by sheep. "So they sent you?" he roared, slamming his hand on the table. "They sent my own wife as some kind of pathetic negotiating tactic? A messenger girl? Do you think that intimidates me?" Clara met his furious gaze with a serene, almost pitying smile. "Not a messenger, Arthur. I am Orion Capital." She slid a final document across the polished surface. It was a notarized and ironclad power of attorney, naming her as the sole beneficiary and designated representative of the entire fund. As Arthur stared at it, the door opened again, and Mr. Sterling stepped inside, his presence lending a historical weight to the proceedings. "Furthermore," Sterling announced, his voice steady and clear, "as a result of the catastrophic quarterly earnings report you tried to bury, the stock price became attractively devalued. Orion Capital was able to acquire a 51% controlling interest on the open market. The transaction was finalized yesterday afternoon." He placed a certified copy of the shareholder registry on the table. The truth was no longer an insinuation. It was a mathematical, legally binding fact. The final pieces clicked into place in Arthur's mind, and the arrogant facade shattered completely. He sank into his chair, his face ashen, looking at Clara as if seeing her for the first time. "You?" he breathed, the word a mix of awe and terror. "But the money, your allowance, it was nothing." Clara's expression remained placid, but her eyes held the cold glint of steel. "You gave me pocket money, Arthur, and you thought I was spending it on shoes.
But I come from a family that taught me to make a garden grow from a single seed. You were so busy building a monument to yourself, you never noticed I was building an empire in your shadow. You taught me everything about this business, its strengths, its weaknesses, its secrets. You just never imagined I was paying attention." She then turned her gaze from her broken husband to the stunned faces of the board. "As the representative of the new majority shareholder, my first order of business is to call for a vote of no confidence in the CEO, Arthur King, citing gross financial mismanagement, reckless endangerment of corporate assets, and a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty. All those in favor, please raise your hands." In a swift, unified motion, every hand at the table, save for Arthur's, went up. The betrayal was absolute. Arthur looked from one face to the next, searching for a single ally, a flicker of loyalty in the eyes of the men who had praised his genius just minutes before. He found nothing but the cold, pragmatic calculus of self-preservation. They were already looking past him, toward their new leader. His empire had evaporated. "Get out," he rasped, the words catching in his throat. Clara's voice cut through his despair, sharp and final. "I believe you are confused about the new power structure in this room," she said calmly. She reached over, picked up the heavy silver nameplate that read Arthur King, CEO, and dropped it into the leather wastebasket beside her with an unceremonious thud. "This is my company now, my boardroom. It is you who will be leaving. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building. Your personal items will be boxed up and sent to you." On cue, 2 uniformed guards entered, their impassive faces a final, humiliating punctuation mark on his spectacular fall from grace. He had been publicly dethroned by the one person in the world he was certain he controlled. As the guards gently but firmly guided a shell-shocked Arthur toward the door, he looked back at Clara one last time. He searched her face for triumph, for hatred, for any sign of the emotional storm he expected to see. But he found only a profound, dispassionate calm. It was the serene expression of an accountant who had finally balanced a long, unsettled ledger. He realized in that horrifying moment of clarity that he was not looking at his wife. He was looking at his creation. A woman forged in the fires of his own arrogance and neglect. Waiting in the lobby, Vanessa saw him being led out by security, her perfectly constructed smile faltering. Realizing instantly that the money train had derailed, she turned and walked away without a word, her stilettos clicking a brisk retreat.
Back in the boardroom, Clara took her seat at the head of the table. She looked at her new board of directors, her voice resonating with an authority that was both earned and undeniable. "Gentlemen, madam," she said, her tone crisp and clear, "the past is behind us. Now let's get to work rebuilding our company. The reign of the arrogant king was over. The era of the underestimated queen had just begun." The fall from the 80th floor was not a physical one, but it was just as brutal. Arthur King, a man who had commanded the city's skyline from his corner office just an hour before, was now a ghost walking through the halls of his own fallen kingdom. The employees he had ruled with a mixture of fear and feigned charisma now averted their eyes, their faces a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. They weren't looking at their visionary leader anymore. They were looking at a liability, a piece of the past being swept out with the trash. Every step he took on the polished marble floor echoed with the finality of his defeat. The heavy glass doors of the lobby, which had always opened for him like a gateway to his dominion, now slid shut behind him with a soft, indifferent hiss.
He stood on the pavement disoriented, as the city bustled around him, oblivious to the titan who had just been toppled. He had spent a lifetime ensuring his name was synonymous with power, but in the space of a single board meeting, Clara had reduced it to a cautionary tale whispered in the elevators he was no longer allowed to use. His first instinct was to fight, to rally his forces. He pulled out his phone, his fingers furiously dialing the numbers of his most powerful allies. The bankers, the politicians, the rival CEOs with whom he shared whiskey and secrets. But the calls went unanswered, diverted to voicemail with a chilling, uniform silence. The news of his ousting, orchestrated by his own wife, had already spread through the city's elite circles like a contagion. He was no longer a king to be courted, but a pariah to be avoided. His carefully cultivated network of influence evaporated in an instant, revealing itself to be nothing more than a transactional web of convenience. When he tried to access his personal accounts to fund his legal counterattack, he was met with a new, colder reality. His assets were frozen, tangled in the corporate structure he had built to protect himself, a structure now controlled by Clara. He was a billionaire on paper, yet he couldn't even afford to hire the sharks he needed to fight the one he had created at home. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, and Clara held the only key. Defeated and financially neutered, Arthur returned to the cavernous mansion that had been his castle, only to find it had become his tomb. The silence inside was oppressive, a stark contrast to the lively parties and fawning staff that had once filled its halls. He wandered through the rooms Vanessa had redecorated, her superficial touch now feeling like a cheap, mocking veneer over the life he had lost. The art on the walls, once symbols of his wealth and taste, now seemed to stare back at him with accusatory eyes. He called his mother, his brother, the family who had so eagerly embraced Vanessa and cast Clara aside, but their voices were distant, laced with a new, cautious tone. They offered hollow sympathies, their words carefully chosen to avoid any real commitment. They had worshipped his power, not him, and now that the power was gone, so was their loyalty. He was utterly alone, a deposed king in an empty palace, haunted by the ghost of a woman he had seen every day, but had never truly seen at all, until it was far too late. The home he had stolen was no longer a home. It was just a very large, very empty building. While Arthur was drowning in the wreckage of his life, Clara was stepping into hers. She did not move into Arthur's ostentatious office with its mahogany throne and panoramic view born of ego. Instead, she chose a corner office on a different floor, one with warmer light and walls she had painted a serene shade of blue. Her first act as chairwoman was not to gloat, but to restore. She reinstated the mild-mannered CFO, Peterson, promoting him to a position of real authority. She called an all-hands meeting, not to announce a purge, but to lay out a vision of stability, integrity, and sustainable growth, all the things Arthur had sacrificed at the altar of his own vanity. She moved with a quiet confidence that commanded more respect than Arthur's booming voice ever had. The employees, who had lived under the shadow of his volatile temper, looked at her with a mixture of awe and relief. She wasn't a conqueror, she was a liberator. She appointed Mr. Sterling as the new CEO, his decades of wisdom finally given their due. Together, they began the meticulous work of rebuilding the company, not as a monument to one man, but as a legacy of true partnership. A week later, Arthur returned to the mansion one last time, a team of movers in tow to collect his personal effects. He found Clara in the grand foyer, not surrounded by lawyers or security, but standing alone, inspecting a crate. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, devoid of the anger or triumph he had expected. "The Basquiat is being sold," she stated simply. her voice as neutral as a market report. The board and I agreed it was a fiscally irresponsible asset, acquired with recklessly leveraged funds.
Its sale will help pay down some of the debt you incurred. Arthur stared at her dumbfounded. The painting, the very object he had used to publicly humiliate her, the ultimate symbol of his power to acquire beauty and dismiss her worth, was being unceremoniously liquidated to balance a spreadsheet. It was the most profound insult she could have delivered, precisely because it wasn't personal. To her, it was just business. He had tried to reduce her to an object, and in the end, she had reduced his ultimate prize to a line item on a ledger, a footnote in the story of his failure. In the end, Clara did not remain in the CEO's world of endless meetings and market battles. After stabilizing the company and ensuring it was in capable hands with Mr. Sterling, she transitioned to the role of chairwoman of the board, a position of ultimate authority that allowed her the freedom she had truly been fighting for. Her victory was not about ruling an empire, it was about reclaiming her own life. The final image of her story is not in a boardroom, but in a small, sunlit studio overlooking a quiet garden, the one she had always dreamed of. She sits at a simple oak desk, managing her own private fund, Orion Capital, now a force for ethical investment. She is serene, powerful, and finally, completely herself. He had tried to write her out of their shared history, to reduce her to a beautiful but silent accessory in his grand narrative. But in the end, his name became a footnote in hers. He had spent a lifetime building a kingdom on a foundation of arrogance, never realizing that the quiet woman in his shadow was not a subject to be ruled, but an architect who knew exactly where to place the dynamite.